I've called the talk today Pollinating Prosperity, sort of riffing off of this concept in my new book. And a pollinator is a self-financing economic development program or company. And what is exciting to me about pollinators is that it allows us to do a lot more inexpensively. And I suspect for many of you that is part of your objective. I want to begin here with Anne Markuson. She's a professor of public policy at the University of Minnesota, and she produced what I think is one of the best books evaluating existing economic development practices and policies. And that existing practice can be summarized as attract and retain. I'm sure many of you use this term, attract and retain, quite often as you explain what you do. And what is odd about the formulation of attract and retain is that it has nothing to do with local business. That is, you cannot attract a local business, that's an oxymoron. And if the only way you retain a local business is by paying it a bribe, then how deep are its roots anyway? So I think what the slogan attract and retain reminds us of is that economic development is focused on one kind of business, but in fact, there may be a good argument for their focusing on the other kind, the local kind. Now, Anne Markuson, in her study called Reining in Corporate Capital, she assembled about 30 experts on attract and retain. About half of them were somewhat excited or sympathetic with the practice, half were critical. And her conclusion with all of these essays was incentive competition is on the rise. It's not on the fall. It is costly, generally inefficient, and often ineffective for winning regions. Now, clearly it's ineffective for losing regions. But the only word that I would disagree with is I believe it is always ineffective for winning regions. And the reason is the opportunity cost. What have you given up by putting a big chunk of money into an outside company that you could have done with local businesses? I have a picture of the clown here because I was speaking in Sarasota, Florida about a year and a half ago. Sarasota is the home of the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus. And shortly before I spoke, they were having a local food week. Someone dropped the local newspaper in my lap, which had a headline talking about a different kind of circus that was going on in the economic development department. And that department of 10 people, it was reported, had done nothing over the previous year, 2 years, but tried to attract an outside company called Xelia from Denmark, a pharmaceutical company. And the headline was that Sarasota had mobilized $137 million to bring this company in. Now, you would think that $137 million might bring you a couple thousand jobs, but in fact, it was fewer than 200. And most of those jobs, in fact, were already filled by outsiders who would be moving into Sarasota. By the way, they lost the bid because a town in North Carolina bid even more money than $137 million. Now, when economic development gets to these kinds of heights, it is utterly irrational, utterly irrational. I mean, we're talking about $717,000 per job. At that per job figure, you could take that same money, put it into a low-risk bond fund and pay a family of 4 a working wage in perpetuity and never need to risk the company. But to sort of emphasize how silly this is, I would suggest that Sarasota could have gotten more economic impact if they really loved the Danes as much as I do. And I love the Danes. I love, Tivoli Gardens. I love Legos. I love unhealthy pastry. If you love the Danes, why not invite 137,000 Danish people, about 4% of the population, to come visit Sarasota and give them a $1,000 gift card that can only be used at local businesses? And I could prove to you, through the magic of input-output economic models, that this would contribute a higher economic multiplier than what this corporate deal would have done. Now, to think about economic development in a different way, I want to introduce you to my buddy here, Lou Stein. Lou Stein is an economic developer in Appalachian, West Virginia. And for 5 years, he created 300 to 500 jobs per year at $500 per job. Now, how did he do this? What was the magical formula? Well, the first thing is he got together groups of people who wanted to form businesses, and he taught them how to do a business plan, how do you access capital. And then he went to existing businesses and he asked them a question that apparently is rarely asked to those businesses there by economic developers, and that is, how can we help? And just that simple question led to information that helped to direct what he did for them. Now, in my mind, Lou Stein economics really points us in a very interesting direction on how to use our money more effectively. And in my view, Lou Stein economics could be reduced to 4 basic rules. Number 1, maximize the percentage of jobs in your economy in locally owned business. Number 2, maximize local self-reliance, not because we want to withdraw from the global economy, but because if you pay attention to the writings of Jane Jacobs, the best way of engaging with the global economy is through import replacement, because then you have hundreds and then thousands of businesses that are looking for global markets and they're not focused in 1 or 2 industries. Number 3, spreading models of triple bottom line success. And number 4, creating an entrepreneurial ecosystem. So I want to speak briefly to each of these to give you a sense about why I embrace these rules. So number 1, why does local ownership matter? This is a study that was done in 2013 in British Columbia, comparing the impact of $1 spent at an independent retailer or restaurant to $1 spent at a chain restaurant or retailer. And what it shows is that $1 spent at the independent restaurant or retailer leads to a recirculation of about 45 cents in the British Columbian economy, whereas at the chain, it's about 18 cents. So roughly speaking, every time a British Columbia resident mindfully spends $1 at a local restaurant or retailer, the province enjoys 2.5 times the job effects, 2.5 times the income and wealth effects, 2.5 times the tax collections, 2.5 times the charitable contributions. We're not talking about small bits of difference. And in point of fact, there's now been about 25 of these studies done in the United States. They all largely point in the same direction, that when you compare 2 businesses, one local, one non-local, you typically get 2 to 4 times the economic development impacts from the locally owned business. But don't take my word for it. This is from the Harvard Business Review in the summer of 2010. The headline, "More small firms means more jobs." It's a regression analysis of regions throughout the United States showing that those regions with the highest density of local businesses have the highest per capita job growth rate. And a similar regression analysis done by the Federal Reserve in Atlanta in 2013 found that per capita income growth rates were also correlated with the density of locally owned businesses. In other words, if you want to eliminate poverty, focus on nurturing locally owned businesses. Rule 2, maximizing local self-reliance. As I said, this is not an invitation to detach from the global economy. It is a strategy for engaging the global economy from a position of strength, with the knowledge that if you nurture many local businesses, they naturally begin to gravitate toward the national and global marketplace, and they don't need subsidies in order to get there. I want to give you an example of a community that used this strategy quite successfully. And it's the story of a delicatessen called Zingerman's. Zingerman's was a successful deli in Ann Arbor, Michigan, a university town, in the 1980s. And then 1990, they sort of hit a fork in the road. They knew they needed to grow if they were going to retain their best managers. The question was, were they going to become a chain deli around the United States? They decided against it for 2 reasons. They cared about quality control. They were afraid they'd lose it. And second, the reason why they loved to come to work was not to get into airplanes, but actually to kibitz with their neighbors. So they decided, rather than grow broad, they would grow deep. And they looked systematically at the things coming into the deli and the things coming out of the deli, and they thought of ways of building businesses around it. So for example, they serve bread on sandwiches. We could create a bakehouse. We serve coffee. We could create a coffee roasting company. We serve ice cream and cheese. We could create a creamery. Then looking at things coming out of the deli, we have great food. We could create a sit-down restaurant called the Roadhouse. We have great cakes. We could create a mail-order cake business. We have great customer service. We could create a training module for other businesses called Zing Train. So in all, Zingerman's is now 10 independently owned businesses that co-license the brand. And the partners meet once a week to do quality control. Collectively, Zingerman's is responsible for about 650 jobs in Ann Arbor and annual sales of over $50 million. So I want to point out a couple of things about this model. First of all, it wasn't done by an economic development agency. It was done by a private business thinking like an economic development agency ought to think. Number 2, the normal advice that one gets from the Michael Porters of the world is to focus on your points of competitiveness, your clusters of competitiveness, and build on them. There was no cluster of food competitiveness in Ann Arbor. Contrary to Michael Porter's predictions, they built a cluster from scratch. And honestly, that is what economic development has to be about in an economy that is highly dependent on a few industries in which you are vulnerable. You've got to diversify and start creating a lot more clusters from scratch. Rule number 3. We don't just care about any kind of locally owned import replacing business. We want businesses with high labor and environmental standards. Now, the typical view is that businesses with these high standards are going to be less competitive, but I think all of us know of examples of businesses that are both good for their workers and good for the environment on the one hand and good for their bottom line on the other. And what I would point out is that, I've been doing some work for Baltimore to help them adopt the B Corp survey as a way of encouraging more of their businesses to ramp up their bottom line standards. And the argument that seems to be quite persuasive to them is that actually many of the triple bottom lines have initial bottom line impacts for economic development. That is that if you pay your workers more, you have more money circulating in the local economy. If you use less energy or water, you're bringing down a bunch of the direct and indirect costs of extracting these things in your community. That list could go on and on. Rule number 4, create an entrepreneurial ecosystem. And this brings me to 6 P's that I think are pretty critical in doing this: planning, people, partners, purchasing, and policy making. By planning, I think, local economic development planning is best done when one studies leakages in your economy. All the places where consumers in your economy are unnecessarily buying outside goods and services, because that flow of dollars gives you knowledge of what are the top priorities for import replacement. People. How do we nurture entrepreneurs who are the leaders of these new import replacing businesses? Partners. How do we make networks of local businesses more competitive as a group than they would be operating on their own? Purse. How do we tap local savings, whether short-term savings in banks or long-term savings in superannuation funds, and put that to work in local businesses? Purchasing. How do we spearhead buy local or local first campaigns by consumers, by businesses, by public agencies? And finally, policy making. I am a policy minimalist, which means that I'm mostly interested in policies that cost almost nothing. And I'm going to share some ideas with you about that in a few minutes. Now, I have to say, over the last 15 years of my being on the bully pulpit and talking about this stuff, a lot of groups I know in the United States have started to move down the track in doing this. And their first impulse, particularly with things like buy local stuff, is to create a campaign that they then go to government and say, give us $250,000 to do a buy local campaign. Or they go to a local foundation. And in my view, it is sort of weird, just like it's weird for mainstream economic developers who are supposed to be supporting entrepreneurship to be giving gifts to entrepreneurs. It's sort of weird for local economic developers to look for charity or look for government funding when they in fact should be doing this in a very entrepreneurial way. So this started to get me to think about, are there examples out there of how people are doing these economic developing policies in a more self-financing way? And it led me to the concept of the bee, the pollinator. Now, bees and pollinators, as you know, they move from plant to plant, they gather up pollens, they diversify the pollen mixture in the environment and thereby support a diverse assortment of plant and animal species. And significantly, bees don't draw a salary from the local government. They do this naturally. Well, it struck me that in the same way, we want to do economic development by having private industry that takes the best practices from local businesses and spreads it around to other local businesses, and does so without needing financial support from the local government. So my most recent book, The Local Economy Solution, has 28 case studies of these pollinator enterprises. And on the flip side of the sheet that I gave to you, I sort of summarize all of them. Now, I don't have time to do more than give you one example from each of the P's, but maybe in Q&A we can go into some of the other models. But I want to suggest that, in each of these first 5 areas, there are really interesting ways that you can support economic development with self-financing entities. So planning. This guy is named Eric Koster. He runs something called the Main Street Genome Project in Washington, D.C., where I live. And he basically goes to small businesses, he gathers information from them, and he shows them ways to improve their efficiency. And then he uses that information to improve the efficiency, and then he splits the gains with them. So he doesn't charge them anything, he just splits the gains. So an example is there are 300 restaurants that he's working with in DC. He gets all of the information on their invoices, and he discovers, gee, you know, Joe, the supplier over there, is selling cauliflower for 50 cents a pound to business A and for $5 a pound to business B. And because these prices are not transparent, the supplier is able to extort the small business. So he then works with the supplier and say, you better get it straight or we're going elsewhere. And he typically saves the businesses he works with 15 to 20% of their input costs. And then, as I said, he splits that between himself and the business he's working with. It is a great model. And it is part of the way of improving business planning, business by business. Purchasing. How can you do buy local activity in a self-financing way? Well, here are my buddies Katrina and Michael Carlo Descato in Portland, Oregon. They have a company called Supportland. It is a loyalty card, and every time you use this loyalty card at a locally owned business in Portland, you get discounts at future purchases from the same local businesses. And the local businesses have seen a dramatic bump in their business and are happy to pay a monthly fee to Supportland for the whole project. Right now there are 80,000 residents of Portland, Oregon who are regularly using this system. And this system has been so commercially powerful, it has spread to a half dozen other communities on the west coast of the United States. People pollinators. You have a lot of incubators. We have a lot of incubators in North America. Nearly all of them depend on government largesse. This guy, Michael Looney Lives, runs an incubator called Fledge that requires no outside money. His model is simple. He works intensively with his businesses for 3 months, and then he takes a 5% stake in the company. The company then has the ability to buy back that stake over the next few years with a royalty arrangement, or not, but either way, the stake or the royalty gives Lives the money back that he has invested in the incubation. It's a brilliant model, and frankly, all of our economic development activity should be built around some kind of model like that. Partnership. Remember again, partnership is an example of how businesses working as a group can be more competitive than they would be on their own. So an example here is Tucson Originals. Tucson Originals is a group of food businesses in Tucson, Arizona that collectively buy foodstuffs, kitchen equipment, dishes, and by buying together, buying in bulk, they bring down the unit prices and make all the businesses more competitive. Purse. There are a zillion examples I could give you of companies that are profitably promoting local investment. But the one that I think will really stretch your imagination is one run by this woman, Linda Best, a former public health advocate in Nova Scotia. In 1998, Nova Scotia in Canada passed a law to make it easier for grassroots groups to form investment funds, and those investment funds can take pension fund money, and in fact, if you put your pension fund money in there, you get a tax credit. So there are now 60 of these funds in a province of 1 million people. You know, I note that in the United States, if we had as many of these funds on a per capita basis, we would have 22,000 of them. It's a great concept, and you know, her fund, FarmWorks, is primarily dedicated to financing local food businesses and farms, but frankly, you could form, you know, local investment funds around manufacturing companies, around smart growth, around healthcare businesses, you name it. Now, I want to just mention a word about public policy. As I said, I'm a public policy minimalist, and I am interested in public policies that support pollinators, that support local businesses, and cost you nothing. So here's an example. The city of Phoenix, Arizona, home of Barry Goldwater, recently moved all of their financing from a global bank to a local bank. And the significance of that is that a dollar put on deposit in a local bank, at least in the United States, is 3 times more likely to find itself lent to a local business than a dollar that's put on deposit in a global bank. And that has a number of significant multiplier benefits. The last point I want to make, and then we'll open it up for discussion, is this. Many economic developers that I talk with say, great stuff, Shuman, but look, we got to support all businesses. Big, little, local, non-local, prison-free, you name it. To which I reply, do you have an unlimited budget? Do you have unlimited time? And the truth is you don't. And you're in an era where government spending is being cut back. You're having to prioritize. And my point is, every dollar that you spend on a likely pointless outside attraction is a dollar that is not spent nurturing one of these other activities. And every hour of your time you spend traveling around the world, having fun doing that, but not bringing home the proverbial bacon, is an hour that is not spent working shoulder to shoulder with your local businesses. So I believe that your responsibility as civil servants is to get the most impact for the least cost. And the verdict is pretty clear. Supporting local businesses is going to be your most cost-effective way of promoting local prosperity. Let me stop there and open it up for discussion.